So I'd like to welcome all our speakers back now for the Q&A session. We have just under half an hour for this Q&A session. I've got lots of questions here, and I'm going to turn to our speakers to tackle those one at a time. But let me start with a nice easy one for me and take chair's privilege. So the first question we had was, will these presentations be available after the seminar has finished? And I'm happy to confirm that yes, all of our speakers have agreed to that, so we will get those up onto the website as soon as we possibly can after this session. And please do make use of that, and indeed all the material from today, because obviously this is the whole purpose of the symposium, is to start a conversation rather than to be an end in itself. So with that practical note addressed, let me start turning to some questions. You've got lots of really interesting questions, and I'm going to start now with one for Ashley, which is a really good one, I think, for somebody in the audience here about this issue of guarantee. And in this case, how do you deal with an inquiry from a customer asking whether you can guarantee that a product is 100% safe for them? And that's from Barbara Hurst. Ashley, what would you say to that?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I think it's a really, really good question. It's all about, for us, it's all about that conversation and providing the information that we've got available. But then, of course, we've got to bear in mind how the packaging is around the product. So if it's pre-packed, we're much more certain. If it's loose and has been made in our busy kitchens, then I wouldn't be able to provide that 100% assurance. But all of our customers can absolutely guarantee that all of our products and ingredients have had that risk assessment end to end, so the information that's provided will be accurate. Whether that's a definite yes, you can eat this safely, or no, you can't, that would be up to the customer to decide from the information we provide.
Great, yeah, thanks. I think we talked this morning, for those of you at this morning's session, about this issue of responsibility on both sides, responsibility to the business and to consumers, and the need for people to clearly think carefully about risk and all those things. And I guess from my scientific perspective, 100% is a number we're very rarely comfortable with, but confidence is always very, very useful. So our next question is for both Sarah and Maggie, and I'll let you decide how you want to tag team this between you, about practical advice to schools on how to work with their caterer better, and understanding the duty that schools have in managing allergies. And then a second kind of related question, perhaps you can wrap them both into the same answer, which is the best way to identify pupils with allergies, particularly in very large schools where having a photo might not be helpful. Do you have any hints and tips for our listeners on how you might tackle that? And I don't know which one of you wants to start. I'll let you wave at each other, and then and perhaps bring in some other speakers afterwards. Thanks.
Shall I?
You start, yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, you
okay. Thank you. A really helpful question for schools and parents alike, and one that I know we get asked a lot about through our helpline and Allergy UK as well. The first and most important thing is a conversation. It's not just a conversation between the school caterers, the school. You need to include the parents, because you absolutely have to understand the allergies of each and every child that you're catering for. The other important thing is to ensure that you do not discriminate any child. If a child has allergies, they're entitled to a meal at school like any other child, and therefore it needs to be an individual discussion between that school, those caterers, and those families, because every school works and operates in a different way, and caterers have different systems and processes. So there isn't one size fits all. It's important that the school and the caterers are all trained and they're all allergy aware, so that they understand exactly what they're dealing with. And that includes volunteer lunchtime staff, because very often schools will have additional staff that come in at meal times to support the children. So those staff too must ensure that they feel confident in supporting children with allergies. Some schools like to give children a different coloured tray so that they can be identified but not not obviously identified. Some schools might use badges to support children. Other schools use lanyards. as a way of identifying children. One, but of course, by using those, you are identifying a child, and potentially that is slightly discriminatory, so might not suit all schools. But I'll hand over to Maggie for her ideas as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with everything that Sarah said. I mean, the policy that's been put together is very much a whole school policy, and clearly from the point of view of the catering provision, that's, you know, an absolutely key part of that. And schools will need to bring all of this approach together through the whole school. It is a whole school, as Sarah says, the lunchtime staff and so on. There was kind of no getting away from that. It's got to run through the schools, and caterers involvement in the development of this approach. When it comes to identifying children, it can be quite a tricky one, because we hear sometimes of schools that sit a child on a table on its own, and that in its own way is quite discriminatory and quite upsetting for a child. So finding the right approach, I think we recognise, can be quite tricky. And we do have, as Sarah said, we have examples of schools that have coloured trays. There are ways to do it, and it's to find the way that the school can deliver, that the parents and the child are comfortable with. But I don't think, you know, we've had, as I say, cases of children that are kind of isolated in order to identify them. And that is really not a good approach, because it is isolating a child and it's discriminatory. I don't think we're saying that this is an easy nut to crack, but there are ways I think we believe that schools can develop in order to easily manage that child and its allergies. And it you know, it's important, and it's a school process to make it work as best it can without making that child feel that it's discriminated, or it's isolated, or it's set apart from the rest of its peers.
That's really useful. I mean, maybe I can just add an extra bit to that, which is, in your experience, you've obviously got far more practical experience of this than many of us on the call, or certainly myself. And I'm wondering, in your experience, you know, how do parents and children react to that balance between being identified and potentially sort of separated versus obviously something that's protecting them? You know, do you feel currently, do we go too far in one direction or the other, or is it very much a case-by-case basis?
I think Sarah perhaps hopefully agree. I think it is a case-by-case basis, and obviously parents play quite an important part in this, in what they feel comfortable with as well, but it still has to be effective. But I think it is a case-by-case basis, and it all kind of at its kind of heart is that collaboration with parents and understanding of that child and what is going to work, so it has to be effective, but also what is not going to be, cause, you know, is not uncomfortable in the environment of a school.
Sarah, did you want to add anything to that, or are you?
I was just going to add that, of course, as the child grows, there may be one practical solution when the child is younger, but as the child grows through the school, then a different solution may suit better. So absolutely, particularly for younger children, parents might feel more confident if their child has a little badge. As the child gets older, the child might not like the badge and might feel much more confident about being able to verbally check what they're being offered to eat. So these are discussions that need to happen not just once, but at each term, each year with the child as the child grows and develops.
Yeah, I think the age of the child is really important in that. I agree.
Yeah, I think I can just imagine now with my now teenage daughter. I'm sure she would have been delighted with the colourful lanyard when she was 6. Probably much less so now that she's pushing 16. Great, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to turn now for a question for Ashley, if we may, about and this is a very interesting one, about what happens when the system goes wrong. So the question is about contingencies that you have in place if software fails and you can't print a label, for example, for PPDS foods in one of your shops. Do you have a fail-safe mechanism?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm not sure if it's fail-safe, but we certainly have contingency plans in place. So, for example, in all of our shops, we have 2 printers. So one in the front of shop, one in the back of shop. So that helps if one of the pieces of hardware goes down. Each area manager group has spare printers and tablets. So if it's a hardware issue, we can get them replaced very quickly in each shop. I think from the connectivity issue perspective, is a bit more tricky, and we had to think a lot more about this than we did just, you know, replacing a unit. So what we've decided to do and is now in place is that the printer will make a copy, like download all of the information, but on a daily basis. So we don't change any specifications or anything, you know, unless we've hit the deadline. They will have to wait until the next day. And that's really to ensure that everything is as up to date as possible, from the specification system to the label software. So that's what we're doing from a connectivity perspective. We're also looking at putting, you know, 2 types of broadband in each shop, which is obviously a much longer term project from the IT perspective. But from a food safety and compliance perspective, that's what we're doing from a software and hardware.
That's really useful to know. I suspect those of us who've been doing a lot of working from home would love the idea of a double broadband connection for everything, actually. Wouldn't
we? I would also like to add on that, Robin, if I could. All of these ideas really are through talking to other businesses and understanding what they've done and what they've decided to do. All that collaboration really helps us get to this space, because, you know, when this issue comes up, you know, you're not on your own. And I think we are in a really good position that food safety is non-competitive, and therefore you can share ideas and collaborate. And I think that's where we get to the best positions, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Dilys, I was going to hopefully bring you in a second as well, from a local authority perspective about that, because it strikes me that this is a place that, you know, this is a very fast moving field. And I wonder if you have a kind of local authority view on, you know, what you would be looking for, what kind of advice you might give to businesses about backups, perhaps businesses who are not in the same position that Ashley is, of having a, you know, very large resource business, for an SME, for example. Do you have any thoughts on that from a local authority perspective?
Obviously, it's extremely wide, depending on sort of the size of the business, and every business needs to take precautions that they feel is adequate in relation to their business. Like, for example, some small businesses might just handwrite labels, or you know, depending on the sort of volume and the throughput that they have. So obviously, the larger manufacturers may obviously take the same sort of precautions that Ashley has just mentioned. It's extremely wide and very difficult to sort of one size fits all, really. And obviously there's the other option, obviously, in that they may wish to then decide to sell food loose, which then means that obviously they can give the information verbally, things when, you know, completely wrong, and they weren't in a position to label sort of pre-packed for direct sale food, for example.
No, absolutely. And I think, I mean, that's, you know, as we've heard all through today, and in wider areas, you know, the food industry is so varied that I think this idea of, you know, a single rule and everyone does exactly that is very difficult to implement. I think that flexibility, as you just mentioned, is really critical. Thanks very much for those answers. So I'm going to move now to a question from Susie and give the panelists 30 seconds break, because I'll give a bit of an FSA answer on this one and then pass to you perhaps for your thoughts. And this question for Susie Charleston is on thoughts about food businesses who refuse to serve those who have allergies or intolerances, even after completing their risk assessment. And I think, you know, this is a really key point, something that really we know causes huge problems for people with hypersensitivities. This sort of, you know, get out of jail free card, and it's really important that is not misused, I think. We know there's been an increased use of waivers and disclaimers in the industry, but that, you know, clearly the message here is that this in no way changes the legal duty of a business to ensure that the food they're providing is safe. You can't, you know, exonerate yourself from that by having a waiver. You know, what we're really keen to do at the FSA is to create a culture in which businesses cater for people with a whole range of hypersensitivities and don't try and sort of duck out of this. So, you know, our recommended good practice is that food businesses understand the allergies of customers and explain very clearly to them what they have and perhaps are not able to control. So, for instance, it is reasonable to say the setup of our kitchen is such that we cannot guarantee control of a particular nut, for example. What is not acceptable is to sort of have a blanket, we can't be worried about allergies because we can't be bothered sort of strategy. But it's really important to stress here, I think, that if the food business has been made aware of a consumer's allergen requirement and has agreed to provide a meal, that they have an obligation to make sure that meal is safe. You can't say one thing and do something else. And so you need those processes in place to understand what's in the food and to communicate that very clearly to the customers you have. So very sort of strong views from our end that, just refusing to serve on a waiver is not an acceptable approach. And I wonder, though, perhaps I can turn to Ashley from a sort of commercial perspective to see your thoughts on this, and then perhaps I'll go back to you, Maggie and Sarah, on how you see this fitting with schools in that particular context. So Ashley first, if you can.
Yeah, on this, I absolutely agree with the FSA. We have an obligation. We must do a risk assessment. We must ensure that the information from that risk assessment is translated appropriately to the customer. A few years ago, we used to use the term alibi labelling, where some businesses in the food industry would just label all 14 allergens as a may contain. I'm pleased to see we're moving away from that. I think the precautionary allergen labelling consultation, that's still open for comments until the 14th of March, if anyone wants to. I think that really is going to make a difference, and I hope it makes a difference. We really need to only inform consumers if there is a risk. Now, yes, if there is a risk, you need to tell them. But if there isn't, let's trust in our processes, in our procedures, in our risk assessment to make sure that they're not alienated and they can't eat anything from any establishment. I think that's really important. You need that communication with your customer, and you need to reassure them, and they need to have that trust in you that you're not just blanket statement on everything as with regards to a precautionary allergen label.
No, absolutely, totally agree there. I'm going to turn to Maggie and Sarah. Perhaps I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this from schools, and whether you've come across schools that sort of tried this kind of a waiver approach. And then lastly, I'll come to you, Dilys, if I may, to ask how you incorporate this into local authority inspections. But Maggie, Sarah, I don't know, from a school's perspective, do you see use of waivers? Is it something that concerns you?
From our perspective, from Allergy UK, I haven't seen waivers like this in schools. I'm not aware of any. We do get a number of people on our helpline complaining because they've been turned away at restaurants, at cafes and so on. We're still getting a regular kind of, I wouldn't say a steady stream, but we do get that complaint. I'm not aware of a waiver in schools. However, I think that for school caterers, I think they're following the best approaches that they can, and I'm not aware of that incident in schools. I don't know about you, Sarah, but we haven't experienced that to my knowledge from the calls that we get from parents. We get a lot of calls about catering in school, but I'm not aware of that particular issue.
So sadly, from an anaphylaxis campaign perspective, we have had, I can think of 2 families who contacted us to say that the school have said that they can't meet a particular child's dietary requirements because of their allergies. And the parents had therefore required to provide a packed lunch for that child. We have try to work with the school to support the school supporting the family and the school caterers, because the schools have a contract with the caterers, and the school contract should be that every child is entitled to a school dinner. The children should not be discriminated against. The caterers should have full training to ensure that they can provide and amend their catering systems to ensure that every child has a school dinner. At the end of the day, children are at school for a large part of their day. In order to engage fully in the educational agenda, they need a substantial meal to support them in doing that. So for us, yes, it has happened, and we reinforced the training the requirement that no child should be discriminated against, and the minute you ask a child they need to take in a packed lunch, then there is discrimination potentially happening there. And that the school have a duty to ensure that the contract they have with the school caterer enables all children to be treated fairly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would totally echo that. Dilys, I'm wondering if I can turn to you and ask in particular how you wrap this into local authority inspections. Do you look particularly for industries that might be trying to use a waiver and give advice on that?
We work very closely with our businesses, and obviously, as I said in my presentation, prevention is very much rather than cure. Obviously, we advise businesses on compliance with the legislation and how they can do that. We will talk businesses through how they can do risk assessments, and we try and coach them and educate them on how they can make sure that the information they have is clear and accurate, and we stress how important communication is for the consumer, because ultimately it is very much a two-way communication here between a consumer and the business, and it's very important that both understand the issues for the particular consumer and the business. And ultimately, it might be an instance where a business's risk assessment shows that it's not possible to provide food safely. And in that instance, we would encourage the business, obviously, to make the consumer aware of that. So it's very important that the consumer is given all of the information that they need so that they are able to make the decision that it is safe for them.
Great, thanks. Now, I guess that's coming back to the point we made earlier about, one size does not fit all in the food industry. It's really important to tackle this on a case-by-case basis. Very helpful. I'm going to stick with schools for the next question. I'm going to stick with the latter double act that we had. So Sarah and Maggie, I'm going to start with you for this one, but then I might turn to you, Dilys, for the local authority response. And this is two questions actually, around the relationship between environmental health, local authorities and schools, particularly around school catering. And the question is, do you see a bigger need for closer engagement between those different organisations to ensure that allergen information conforms to current legislation in schools? And secondly, what more do you think we should be doing in schools to safeguard people with allergy? So I'm going to turn first to Maggie and Sarah, and then Dilys from your perspective afterwards, if that's all right.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
So absolutely, I don't think you can ever say that a relationship can't be big enough when you've got two different agencies working together. Both have got something to bring to the table, and that collaboration can only enhance the level of understanding, the level of knowledge, and therefore be protecting and supporting an allergic child in school. For school caterers, they really do need to know the legislation, and environmental health can play a huge role in that, in supporting them both know the legislation, if they don't know it, where to find it and understand it, and then it's interpreting. So what does this mean? How do we make this legislation work in practice? And I think environmental health have got a huge role to play there. So I would extend the question to environmental health and the FSA, because the FSA training in relation to the legislation is really important. So that's I would totally agree that needs to happen. Over to you, Maggie.
No, I would support that. I mean, one of the things in the policy, obviously, we talk about schools adhering to legislation around food, school caterers adhering to legislation around food regulations. So it's obviously that's a really key part and an important part. So I would agree with that. The more collaboration and the more support, the better.
Great, thanks. Yes, and absolutely. I should have. The question didn't address FSA, but clearly we are a big player in this too, and you're very keen to hear people's thoughts about what is working well and perhaps what more should be done. Dilys, I wonder what your thoughts on this are from a local authority. What's the best way to engage between local authorities, environmental health, and schools, and what more would you like to see done in that area?
In Caerphilly, we've got a very, very close working relationship with our catering services team, with our procurement team. It goes right through really. We very much engage with them. Environmental health deal with the safety and the hygiene. Training standards deal with the food standards issues. We've done joint training with our catering services. As I explained in my presentation, we've trained in the region of over 500 staff, which included many of our catering staff internally, which was exceptionally well received, and absolutely incredibly raised allergens to a new level in Caerphilly in terms of the understanding of it, and using the resources, Lancashire's resources in particular, was an excellent way of getting over the consequences of things going wrong, and how people actually live day to day with an allergy. So I absolutely agree. I think collaboration between the services is absolutely imperative, and thankfully in Caerphilly that's something that we do very well.
Great, thanks very much. That's a theme we've heard a lot today. I think about, this is not a problem that anyone can solve on their end. It's that collaboration that is absolutely essential. So we're coming towards the end of the Q&A session. I'm hoping we've got time for 2 more questions. Let's see how we go. The first of which is, I think, Ashley, I'm going to direct this to you, if I may, because it's around choice, essentially. So the question is, do you think that the kind of growing awareness of hypersensitivities, particularly amongst food businesses, will end up turning things very bland? Will hospitality in particular and retail move towards a more restricted, blander sort of diet, simply to get away from some of the challenges associated with controlling allergies in more diverse food types? I don't know, from your perspective, Ashley, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think anyone who is a customer of Greggs will know that we certainly don't have a bland kind of menu there, and obviously with our vegan range, which I'm not plugging it, but obviously it speaks for itself really with the amount of media and press that it gets. So I'm not sure this is going to be the case. I don't know who was present this morning, particularly for your presentation, Robin, but we talked about new novel foods, novel processes and things, and although we need to keep an eye on that from the unintended consequences perspective, I think that we find a way, science always finds a way, food science and technology finds a way to deal with hurdles. And I don't think the answer is more restricted and bland food. I don't think customers generally would, or consumers generally, I should say, would put up with that. And I can't see any business really just sitting on their laurels, just thinking, oh, well, this is the state of play now because it's too difficult. We will always find a way.
That's very upbeat. I like that upbeat assessment, Ashley. Thanks. I'm wondering, to wrap into this also the schools perspective, Sarah and Maggie, I'm wondering, is this something you've come across in your work with schools? Do schools compress their menus in order to avoid some of these challenges? Or actually, is it more like Ashley has described, it's like stimulating innovation and more expansive menus to deal with people with a range of dietary requirements?
I mean, we've certainly had comments from parents about schools compressing their menus. I think that certainly is something that we've been aware of. I think Sarah would agree. We've had a couple of cases of that we've both been involved in terms of whether menus are becoming more creative, or I think that is a possible good outcome, but the compressing menus is certainly something that has come through from parents, and that of course then and back to Sarah's point about the duty to provide a meal, then that restricts choice, and that becomes a difficult situation for a parent and for the child. So we have seen that. I think that's fair to say.
Yes, I can. I would agree with Maggie. I think one of the problems with compressing a menu is that menus are compressed to take account of the 14 FSA common allergens, but actually children, if we're talking about schools, children have allergies to foods wider than the 14. So we had the case of a child who was offered a meal, but actually he still had an allergy to the food they were offering because the compressed menu focused on the 14 common allergens. So by compressing a menu, actually you're not making it safer, you're reducing the likelihood that that child can have a hot meal, and out in the hospitality area, again, you're reducing the likelihood that a family can eat in that restaurant or in that service area.
Yeah, absolutely. And it strikes me that, particularly the time when we're obviously very conscious of the health impacts of school meals, particularly around things like obesity and nutrition, the last thing we want to be doing is compressing an option into something that may not be a good option for everyone. Okay, we're almost out of time on this. I'm going to take one last quick question and hopefully ask for some quick answers. Ashley, first from you, and then Maggie and Sarah from you, perhaps from an allergy perspective, which is around food labelling and the strategy for that. We mentioned this morning in my talk and in Rebecca's talk about the time it takes someone with an allergy to read food labels and the increasing problem that presents, and the potential for technology to help here. So electronic labelling, QR codes, those kind of things. Just briefly, Ashley, first from a commercial perspective, is this something you see happening? Is this something that Greggs is interested in, this idea of electronic labelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one step at a time, isn't it? And it's getting the allergen labelling correct on pack first, and then looking at how you can transcribe that into something else. We are obviously looking at starting to label our loose foods. So we are looking at digital ticketing, as we would call it, digital strip edge. So that could be updated, as soon as something changed in a product or an ingredient. All of our allergen information is available online and on our app. So, I think particularly that's good for younger teenage populations where they might be thinking of something. They might know they're going to a particular place for lunch with their friends, but they can then look in advance separately without worrying about, having to make that kind of, that differentiation between them and their friends at the time. So I think that there's lots of things we can do, but I think really, to start with, we need to make sure the whole industry is getting the allergen labelling correct. And obviously from the precautionary allergen labelling, the consultation response, we need to really work on that as an industry as well. So that those were my first thoughts on that.
Great, thanks. And last word to Sarah and May, from a perspective of people who have allergies or hypersensitivities, do you think there is a big demand for electronic labelling? Is this something they see as being potentially transformative to their lives?
I think we need to ensure that there's different type. I would agree with Ashley. We need to make sure the labelling is accurate in the first instance. But then I think we need to be able to meet the different communities. So we need to consider people who are blind, people, visually impaired people, the younger audience, the older audience, the IT literate, those who aren't as IT literate. So I don't think one size fits all. And I think we have to make sure that everybody is able to read the labels, that everybody has a right to know what they're eating. And therefore labelling has to be available in a way that is accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I think that for people living with a food allergy, then the labels that are absolutely crucial, and they are, they're very in our experience, they're very robust in reading labels. That's such an important kind of part of what they do in their shopping. They're looking at labels, and the most important thing is that information is clear, that it's accessible, and that they're given the information that they need. The more complex or more kind of technical approaches, I think, are sort of up for discussion. But I think it really is what's the most accessible way of providing information that those people absolutely need in order to keep safe.
Great. That was really, really useful. I'm afraid we're out of time for Q&A. For those who've posted questions that we haven't had time to answer, I'm very sorry. We will try and pick up offline with some of those. Huge thanks to all our speakers this afternoon, both for your talks and for that really engaging Q&A session.